Devotion for Thursday, October 29th. Good morning. Time for another cup of tea or coffee with me and Jesus and all the other people who are viewing this devotion, especially those kind-hearted people who do it through the Spiritual Disciplines Practice group on Facebook. Well, today let's talk about conversation with God. Do you know that's the ultimate goal of all spiritual practices? As Jen Johnson so well says, we in turn practice our talking and listening skills in our quiet time so that they come naturally to us in all the dailiness of life. Ever think about quiet time as a practice for life? So she and many spiritual writers, as we've already pointed out, have pointed us already to the 17th century example of Brother Lawrence, but let's look at the primary biblical example, and that's a person who's called the friend of God 3 times in the Bible. That's none other than Abraham. He's called the friend of God by God himself in Isaiah 41:8, in the New Testament by James in 2:23, and then by Jehoshaphat in 2 Chronicles 27. And all those people who listed him as a friend of God are also people who seem to have a friendship conversation going on with God. So maybe they learned a little bit of something as they viewed him, Abraham, in that way. And so let's see if we can join them. Hear how Johnson describes the ongoing conversations between Abraham and God. She says these conversations were filled with back and forth elements, such as questions, guesses, reassertions, incredulity, calculated pauses, statements of fear and doubt, and careful restatements of each other's thoughts. Sound familiar to you? Sounds like my marriage, and maybe makes you think of a close human relationship. But doesn't it really make you want to examine Abraham's life, his relationship to God? Did he really? How? Well, let's look. You first introduced to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, and from chapter 12 through 14, you're basically seeing a one-way conversation. The very encouraging words from God and promises and vision for him and guidance. But all you see from Abraham are mostly faithful actions mixed in, like the rest of us, with some faithless actions. All that changes, though, in Genesis 15, a chapter, especially verse 6, that's like the most quoted verse in the whole New Testament. There you hear God breaking into probably Abraham's troubled dreams and thoughts. "Do not be afraid, Abraham, for I will protect you and reward you, and your reward will be great." Abraham returns, "Oh, sovereign Yahweh, what good are all these blessings when I don't have a son? One of my servants will have to be my heir." And God says back, "No, your servant will not, for you'll have a son of your own to inherit." Then Yahweh brings Abraham outside like a good friend, tells him to look up into the heavens and count the stars, he says, if you can. That's what your descendants are going to be like. Why do you think God did that? Well, it gave him a visual reminder of what he's saying, and also a reminder of who he is. And it does the same for us. And then he says, "I'm Yahweh who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land." So reminding him of their history and his generosity towards him. And then Yahweh does something unbelievable. He cuts a covenant with Abraham, and for that I'll have to read it so you can see how that was practiced in these days. In verse 8 of chapter 15, or 9, "Then the Lord told him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon." Then Abraham takes these, kills them, and cuts them in half, as was done in those days, laying the halves on side by side, except for the birds. He didn't do it with them. And then later he has to chase off vultures before the sun goes down. Finally, when sundown comes, Abraham falls asleep into a deep sleep with a terrifying vision of darkness. And then here's the Lord telling him, you can be sure that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land, and they'll be oppressed as slaves for 400 years. But I will punish the nation that enslaves them, and in the end, they'll come away with great wealth. But you will die in peace at a ripe old age, he reassures. And then he goes on to say, after 4 generations, your descendants will return here to this land when the sin of the Amorites has run its course. So he's telling him history, basically, right here. And then as the sun goes down, Abraham sees, it becomes dark, and Abraham sees a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passing between the halves of the carcasses. That was the practice when they cut a really serious covenant. And what it was meaning is, so shall it be, and more so to me, if the things that I say I don't do. And so what has God said he's going to do? Well, he repeats it afterwards. He says, so the Lord makes the covenant with Abraham that day and says, I have given this land to your descendants all the way from the border of Egypt to the great Euphrates River. God's basically saying, if these things don't happen, let God die. Well, aren't we glad that that didn't happen? And it never happens. And God always keeps his word. And Abraham becomes the example of living in the light of that. But you know what? Jesus did the same thing. He cut a covenant for you and me, and he didn't use animals. He cut a covenant in his own blood, guaranteeing sacrifice. That's why he calls you and me his friends in John 15 and 15. So, let's get talking to him. He's a great friend.